Welcome to the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast, where we hope to inspire you to embrace your God-given gifts, skills, and passions in order to lead with confidence. This podcast is for the Christian woman like you, who is driven and inspiring, sensitive yet strong. And maybe, like me, you felt like you're a little bit too much at times. I want you to remember that you, my friend, are a chosen daughter of the King, and you have been fearfully and wonderfully made. I'm your host, Esther Littlefield, and I'm going to be joined by my co-host, Holly Kane, and sometimes by other guests. Join us as we discuss leadership as a Christian woman in our churches, business or workplace, communities, and our homes. We're so glad you're here. Now on to the episode. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this episode. I'm Esther, and I'm here with my co-host, Holly.
Hi, Esther.
Hey, Holly. So glad you're here with me. In this episode, we want to discuss what leadership is and why your leadership matters as a Christian woman. We'll share our own perspectives on this topic, but first, let's start with what leadership is not. So, leadership is not a position or a title. Sometimes people are in positions of leadership, but they're not actually a leader. It's also not simply being the boss. It's also not expecting everyone else to do the work. And I know I've seen that happen in leadership roles sometimes.
Yeah.
Leadership is not being the loudest person in the room. So just because someone takes charge and is vocal doesn't necessarily make them a leader. And it's also not just being a people person. Right. So do you have any others, Holly, that you can think of?
Definitely. So I think it's also, it's not just demanding or expecting respect from the people that are underneath you or the team that you're working with. It's not having all the answers, and it's not necessarily being perfect. You don't have to have everything figured out to be a leader. Being a leader is not controlling everything that happens. I guess the key word there would be you're not micromanaging. And it's not necessarily knowing everything that's needed for the job or the task right off. So that's what leadership is not. But we're going to shift our focus to what good leadership is. So what are some ways of looking at leadership? Let's start with how the dictionary defines leading. The definition of leading is to go before or with to show the way, to conduct or escort, by holding or guiding, to influence or induce, to cause.
Yeah, that's a great place to start. And another person that I look up to a lot and hear from about leadership is John Maxwell. He defines leadership as influence. In the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership, John says, "True leadership cannot be awarded, appointed, or assigned. It comes only from influence, and that cannot be mandated. It must be earned. The only thing a title can buy is a little time, either to increase your level of influence with others or to undermine it." So I think we can agree that leadership is not simply having a title or being placed in a position that carries the responsibility of leading.
I really like that. So do you have any examples of times when you've seen someone in a leadership role, but who is not actually a leader?
I do have an example of this. I had a former job and I was working as an ed tech at a school for children with developmental disabilities. And there were actually 3 of us ed techs in the classroom along with the lead teacher. And the teacher, who was technically the boss and in charge of the classroom, was not a leader, even though, he was tasked with leading us as the ed techs. And so oftentimes we were the ones coming up with the activities for the children that we were working with. We would often take charge and give our ideas about how we could best serve the children. But then in meetings, he would take responsibility for all the activities and the progress that the child had made. And he would rarely acknowledge the ed tech who spent the majority of her day with the child. And then he was also a micromanager. And this was really, for me, the straw that broke the camel's back, because when he did come up with activities or tasks for us to do, he would literally look over our shoulders while we did it. and he would be pinpointing every little thing that we were doing and making sure that we were doing it just the way that he wanted it done. And so it was a really challenging environment to work in. And I actually eventually made the choice to leave because it was so stressful to work in that environment.
Mhm.
So that's my experience with that. What about you, Holly?
So I definitely have experienced this when I was working as a receptionist at a pediatric clinic. It was a specialty clinic, so there were a lot of really difficult things that we were dealing with. But I had a manager at the time who was not interested at all in cultivating her employees. There was lots of finger pointing over broken processes. She didn't really listen. She didn't celebrate our wins. She came down really hard on the mistakes that we made and didn't help us fix the problems. And at one point, towards the end of my time there, she expected me to handle and effectively do three separate positions in the amount of time that I was doing my original position. So I got three separate jobs piled on me to do at one time, and there was lots of micromanaging. I did end up leaving because I couldn't handle the fact that a lot of my opinions and a lot of the things that I could see to fix the broken processes weren't being listened to, and a lot of other decisions were being made. And it was really difficult to try to create better processes and not have her listen to me. So I did end up leaving. And in fact, it took me a lot of time to gain back my confidence in the new position that I had. And I was under good leadership. Um, and so it can be quite detrimental to a person when they're under someone that's not a great leader. So,
I think that's such a good point, Holly, because when someone is in a position of leadership, but they are not actually developing as a leader, or they're not a leader themselves,
mhm,
it often drives away the potential leadership that they have underneath them. Like in both of our
definitely.
situations, we both were people that could have contributed to those organizations in a stronger way. But because of the person over us, who was technically
Mhm.
our leader, we made the choice to leave because we weren't listened to, we weren't appreciated. So I just think it makes such a good point that when someone is in a position of leadership, the responsibility that they have to the people that they're leading.
It's pretty great, right? I mean, you can take someone who's not a leader and pretty much discourage them
Yeah,
into not pursuing leadership again in the future.
exactly.
So we've covered what leadership is not, as well as some definitions of leadership. Now let's talk a little bit about what we believe leadership is and what it looks like in everyday life.
All right, awesome. So we came up with a list of 14 things that we believe leadership is. And so we're going to talk about these 14 things. I'm just going to list them off, and then we're going to chat a little bit more in depth. And just so you know, if you're listening to this episode, we do have show notes for this episode. And so you will be able to get this full list in the show notes. So don't worry about taking notes if you're, driving or doing the dishes or something. So, so number one is that leadership is doing the things that other people won't do, or showing up when others don't. Secondly, it's serving those you lead. Number three, leadership is listening. Four, leadership is identifying the needs of those that you lead and finding ways to meet them. Five, leadership is earning the right to speak into others' lives. And then number six, leadership is seeing potential in others, even when they don't see it in themselves. That's a little bit about what we talked about earlier.
Hmm.
Seven, leadership is communicating a vision for the future. And then eight is bringing clarity. Nine, leadership is a commitment to personal growth and a dedication to continually move forward. 10, it's celebrating wins and speaking positively about people and your team. 11, leadership is responsibility for outcomes, both good and bad. 12, it's challenging the status quo. 13, being sensitive to the Holy Spirit's guidance. And then number 14, it's following the example of Christ and being led by him as you lead others.
Mm.
So we're going to talk about these for a few minutes. And I'm going to start just with number 1, in that leadership is doing the things that other people won't do or showing up when others don't. And I've found that one of the things that can be really challenging as a leader is that a lot of times you are there alone.
Yeah.
So it means showing up early and leaving late a lot of times. If
Mhm.
you're putting on an event, for example, and you're leading that event, you're often doing a lot of things behind the scenes that other people don't see and don't know about. And so it's not always the glamorous stuff. I've had times when I've led a Bible study and I've shown up for Bible study and literally no one else has showed up. When you're not in that role of leadership, you have the choice of whether or not to show up. So that's the
Mhm.
first one. And then secondly, I think, it's so important to serve those you lead. And Jesus really is the perfect example of this, in that
Mhm.
in his time here on earth, you saw him leading by serving. He was constantly looking
Mhm.
around and seeing who had a need, and he was serving those people, and he was doing things that seemed very unusual in the serving, washing his disciples' feet and being the person who really should have been having his feet washed. So
Yeah.
I think serving is so important. How about
Mhm.
you, Holly? Do you have some that stand out to you?
Definitely. So I think that for me, the third and fourth one really go together. Number three was listening. And I think many times we feel like leadership is being the, as we said before, being the mouthpiece, being the person that's the biggest voice in the room. And when in fact, leadership is really listening, listening to what's going on. In the problems that you're trying to solve, listening to what's coming out of your team members' mouths. And then, therefore, number four, identifying the needs of those you lead and finding ways to meet them. So, really, your goal as a leader is to be really aware of what's going on and to be sensing the things that maybe they're not even saying out loud, and trying to find ways to meet them where they're at. I know that can be a little bit difficult, but I think that as you grow in rapport with your team, that becomes more and more easy. And as you sort of speak to each individual team member about what their needs are, you kind of grow in that, in learning to listen to them and in learning to identify with what they're looking for. So, what about you, Esther?
I think that number 8 is so key, bringing clarity. And the best leaders that I have followed and seek to emulate are those that bring clarity to situations that can feel confusing or challenging.
Yeah.
And they're able to, bring things back to what's most important. And I think a lot of times clarity is really getting back to the heart of what you're trying to accomplish, whether it's the mission of your organization or the vision of the church, or the ministry that you're running or your business, whatever it might be. Having that ability to bring clarity and not leave people confused is so important. And
Mm.
then I also really love, and personally, this is probably one of the ones that I have found to be most helpful for me, is a commitment to personal growth and just that dedication to moving forward no matter what. And I had a team leader in a previous job that I was in that just was such a great example to me of this. She was constantly, investing in her personal development and giving us books that we could read, and doing trainings for us that we could listen to that would help us grow as a team and as individuals. And she also, did a lot of the other things on this list. And so she has stood out to me, even though I didn't know her super, super well. She was someone who I really looked up to and who mentored me when I was kind of starting out in leadership.
That's so important. I think that for me, the other two that really stand out to me are the celebrating wins. I love it so much when a boss or a leader speaks positively about their other team members. I think that it really encourages them to do a better job, and it really shows them, it shows the team, it shows the employees that you're paying attention to what they're doing and that you take stock and you take weight in the stuff that they're doing, and it really matters. I actually have an example of that in my current transition. I am transitioning out of a leadership position, and I have two of my team members that I've worked with are coming up behind me, and one is stepping into my position and one is taking on more responsibilities. And although this transition has been somewhat difficult for me personally because I love this position so much, it has been super exciting to see them step up and fulfill the roles that I know that they have the ability to do. And I've been really bragging up their skills to the owners of the company that I work for. And they have been in turn saying, Holly's been saying really great things about you. They know that I really trust them and that I feel like I'm passing off this position to them in a positive way. And they feel like they can handle it even when right now it feels overwhelming. So I think that that just really creates trust within the team, and it really helps people and encourages them.
Yes, I totally agree with that, Holly, because I have seen how just that positive energy spreads throughout the team. If the leader is celebrating the wins, then that becomes the culture of the team. And if a leader is really negative,
Mhm.
then that becomes the culture of the team. And it really does start with the person at the top, so to speak, being the one to lead the way in how they speak about other team members and being positive and calling out that potential too, like you said.
Right,
When you are actually calling out potential in people, that does wonders.
right. I agree wholeheartedly. And I think that actually segues really nicely into number 11, responsibility for outcomes. I think that while the leader is responsible for whether it is a good outcome or a bad outcome, I think that this speaking positively about each other and having the positive environment really helps when the outcomes are good and when they're bad. I think that if you are going into something knowing that perhaps it could fail and you are maintaining a positive culture, when that failure does come, people are going to look at it from a positive aspect and something that they can learn from. But I think this is also something to remember when you're stepping into leadership, that you in fact are the end all be all when it comes to the outcome. And if it's good or if it's bad, you are on the line for that,
Right.
whatever that item is. Um, so there's a weight that comes to it.
Right. And there's nothing worse than seeing a leader blame their team for something that happened. Because
Definitely.
ultimately it comes back to us that if we're the one running the team, then if our team members didn't do what they were supposed to do, we need to be willing to take that responsibility. Even if they did fail in a way, um,
Mhm.
then we need to work with them. We need to help them, or we need to find a different team member sometimes, and
Yeah.
that's hard to think about, but it always comes back to our responsibility. So,
Mhm.
yeah. So, a couple others that really have stood out to me from this list is number 13, being sensitive to the Holy Spirit's guidance. And I think that I've seen this happen, especially in church roles, when there's times when something doesn't make sense to do or to not do, but the leader is being led by the Holy Spirit to do that thing or to not do that thing. And
Mhm.
so we have to trust when God's in charge, like we have to trust that he knows better than we do. And
Mhm.
sometimes his plan is not necessarily matching up with our ideas of what we think is the right thing to happen. And then, again, that kind of goes along with following the example of Christ and being led by him in that he did a lot of things here on earth that didn't make sense to the people around him. He broke some rules, some religious rules. He did some things that didn't make sense to people because he was following the will of God and not what made sense to, our earthly minds. So
Mm,
that's something that I have found to be so important.
definitely. And I think that as I think about this, my thoughts really go back to my mentor in women's ministry, Sandy at our church. She is really fantastic at this and has no problem saying things to the effect of, I'm not really sure about that. Let me pray about it and let me see what God is saying to me about this. And then we move forward with how she feels God is impressing her. She is so great at that. And I just very much appreciate her willingness to really yield to what God is saying to her. And it's exciting to hear her say that, because I've actually heard some of our women say to her, "Hey Sandy, what's God saying to you for our ministry?" They're asking for that. And
Wow.
that is infectious, and I so appreciate that. And she created that. I mean, obviously the women are sensitive to God too, but
Yeah.
it's what she's willing to say and model for the women in our ministry. So,
Right.
which I think is a great segue. This is a podcast for women, and we are talking about how women approach leadership.
Right.
So, when we look at a majority of leadership roles in companies as well as in churches, we see a lot of men. And for example, as of May 2018, there are 24 female CEOs in the list of Fortune 500 CEOs. And that's just under 5% of the total list. And most of those women are white. Only two of them are women of color. So, this lack of female representation among leadership can make it tough for women to feel like there's potential for them. The lack of role models and mentoring can make it more challenging for women.
But what we want you to know is that your leadership matters. And as women, we believe that we have some unique qualities that help us approach leadership differently. And we don't have to lead in the same way as men, nor do we have to try to be just like them. So we're not saying that men or women lead better or worse than each other. We are just different. And we want to embrace the fact that as women, we can bring something different to the table.
Yeah.
And there's a really great video, which we're putting in the show notes of this podcast, from the former global CEO of Chanel, Maureen Shakay, and I'm hoping I said her name right. And she talks about the fact that women need to embrace being themselves as leaders instead of trying to emulate everything that men do. And she gave an example of when she was going for a leadership position and kind of the scenario she was faced with. So I'd encourage you to check that out and watch her video. So I'd love to know, Holly, what you think some of the unique qualities that women have in leadership roles. And we're making broad generalizations here. We realize that not everybody may fall in these generalizations, but what do you think are some of the things that a lot of women bring?
In general, I think that women tend to be more nurturing, and our goal is to develop people. And I think that we are more relational and we're able to connect with people on sometimes even a deeper level. I think that we have really great intuition. And I think that that's very useful to a woman in leadership to have those relationships and to be able to be intuitive about what's going on in their team. Esther, can you think of any others?
I would say right along with that, with the intuition, is a lot of women tend to be more sensitive. And I'm sure we'll talk about this more because this is one of my things that I like to rant on. But I don't believe that being sensitive is a bad thing. I think
Right.
that having a sensitivity of spirit and picking up on, whether it's the Holy Spirit or whether it's just sensing what other people are feeling or experiencing, and knowing kind of it's a good time or a bad time to say something, that is a huge advantage for leaders. And then I would say empathy as well. I think that a lot of women are able to empathize and put themselves in someone else's shoes more easily than some men. And so I think that those unique qualities that we as women possess, we should use them to our advantage. We shouldn't try to compete necessarily with men or do things just like them, but we can take these things in the way that God has wired each of us uniquely as
Mhm.
well. And we might all have a different range of skill sets and a different range of qualities that we can bring to the table in our leadership. And so that's what we want you to do, is to walk away knowing that you can be a leader, that being a woman doesn't set you up to not be a leader. Even if you don't
Right.
see the examples that you would like to see in your workplace or in your career, uh, it doesn't prohibit you from making progress. So,
Right.
Holly, what is your takeaway from our conversation today?
I think my biggest takeaway is that we need women in leadership. Even though our leadership roles may look different than men, that's okay. And it doesn't have to look perfect. We need more women mentoring future leaders as well. I think that the more we can bring more women along and encourage them to lead, the better off we all are. So, Esther, as we close, let's celebrate some leadership wins. Do you have a win for this week?
I do, actually. I am just really excited that we are getting this podcast started. So, for me, the real win is
Yeah.
taking action even when it wasn't perfect and I didn't feel
Mhm.
ready. Because starting a podcast is there's a lot involved. And for a long time, I was thinking, oh, I've got to wait until I get this just right. And I gotta do this thing. And oh, I gotta re-record that thing. And this past week, we took some action and we just got some stuff done and got our trailer episode up on the podcast feed and on iTunes, which was really fun and exciting. So, how about you, Holly? What's your win for the week?
Well, first, I want to say congratulations to you because that's really hard. I know it's not super easy to push forward when you don't feel like you're ready or when things aren't perfect. And Esther has done a really great job. She's been at the forefront of getting this podcast up and going. So thank you very much, and you're doing a really great
Oh, thank you.
job. Okay, so me, let's see. I think I'm going to go back to that work transition that I talked about earlier. It's been very difficult for me to leave this position of 5 years, and I worked really hard to put in some processes and to make some really positive changes in my position and in the department and in the company as a whole. And to feel as though I'm passing off the best possible product or the best possible department that I could to the people coming behind me feels really good. And also feeling as though the people that I'm passing off to are really capable of taking it on and even capable of doing it better than I could do. Because
Mm,
that's really the whole point, is to encourage them to move on and move forward and to do
yeah.
bigger and better things that I could have even done in the position. So that's a really big win for me. And it's really personal because I hate having to leave, but I hopefully will be on to bigger and better things as well. So
Right.
that's my win.
Awesome. And I think we didn't even mention this earlier, but I think that kind of sums up what leadership is about, in that
Mhm.
it's working yourself out of a job.
Yeah,
Like, if you do
definitely.
leadership right, you will do the role for a while and then
Mhm.
you will end up passing on that role to someone else. And that just is a great example of how you did that in your own life. So I love
Yeah.
it.
So thanks everyone for joining us as we've talked about what leadership is not, what it is, and why your leadership matters as a woman. We would love to hear what you think.
So, yes, we would love to have you join us as we discuss this in our Purposeful Leadership Facebook group. To join the group, just go to estherlittlefield.com/group and you will be able to jump into the conversation. Just look for the post about this episode, and we would love to hear what you think about leadership and about how women can uniquely lead in their leadership roles. Thank you guys for joining us. For the show notes for this episode, head over to estherlittlefield.com/leadership. Thanks again for joining us on this episode of the Christian Woman Leadership Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And of course, you can leave us a rating and review, and this will help more women like you find the podcast. And don't forget, your leadership matters, and it's time for you to embrace your gifts and lead with confidence.